Please, don't leave me again. The words were barely louder than a whisper, yet they stopped Ethan Walker cold in the middle of a rain-soaked November night. He had never seen the woman before in his life. He had no idea who she was, and he certainly didn't know that those 5 trembling words would unravel a secret buried for more than 12 years. The rain fell steadily over downtown Asheville, North Carolina, turning the sidewalks into mirrors of neon reflections and blurred headlights. Most people hurried past with collars raised and heads down, eager to escape the cold. Ethan adjusted the hood of his worn work jacket and glanced toward the entrance of the luxury hotel across the street. His 10-year-old daughter Lily sat quietly in the passenger seat of his aging Ford F-150, waiting while he picked up a repair invoice from a customer. It should have been an ordinary night, the kind of night that faded from memory before morning. Then he saw her. A woman sat alone on a stone bench near the hotel entrance. Her dark coat hung loosely from her shoulders. Her head was lowered. Rain dampened strands of chestnut hair that clung to her face. A few hotel guests glanced her way before continuing inside. Nobody stopped. Nobody asked if she was okay. Ethan hesitated. Life had taught him not to interfere where he wasn't wanted. But life had also taught him something else. Sometimes people needed kindness more than they needed explanations. He crossed the street. As he approached, he noticed expensive heels beside the bench, abandoned as if she had simply given up caring. Her eyes opened slowly when she sensed him nearby. They were striking gray eyes, clouded by exhaustion and something deeper. Loneliness. "Ma'am," Ethan asked gently, "do you need help?" She blinked several times as though trying to focus. For a moment, she simply stared at him. Then her expression softened, not with recognition, with confusion. The kind that comes from carrying too much pain for too long. "Please," she whispered, "don't leave me again." Ethan frowned. "I think you've got the wrong person." A faint, heartbreaking smile touched her lips before her eyes drifted closed again. Somewhere, behind them, the hotel's revolving door spun. Laughter echoed briefly from the lobby before disappearing into the rain. Ethan looked around. No family, no friends, no security, no one searching for her. He checked the identification card partially visible inside her designer purse. Charlotte Bennett. The name meant nothing to him. Just another stranger having a difficult night. Yet something about her felt familiar. Not her face, not her voice. The sadness, the quiet weight she carried. It reminded him of someone he had loved and lost. Someone whose absence still lingered in every corner of his life. Ethan exhaled slowly. "Come on," he said softly. "Let's get you somewhere warm." Across the street, Lily watched through the windshield as her father helped the stranger toward the truck. She couldn't know it then. Neither could Ethan. But as Charlotte Bennett settled into the passenger seat and the truck pulled away from the curb, fate was already moving silently beside them. And somewhere, hidden in a truth no one had yet uncovered, the past was preparing to come home. The drive home was quiet except for the steady rhythm of rain tapping against the windshield and the soft hum of the truck's aging heater. Charlotte Bennett slept peacefully in the passenger seat, her head resting against the window, unaware of where she was or who had chosen to help her. Ethan kept his eyes on the road. He did not ask questions. He did not expect answers. That was not who he was. Beside him, Lily watched the stranger curiously. "Is she okay, Dad?" she asked softly. Ethan glanced toward Charlotte before returning his attention to the road. "I think she has had a very hard day." Lily nodded as if that explanation was enough. In many ways, it was. Children often understood things adults complicated. The small house sat just outside town on a quiet stretch of road bordered by tall pines and open fields. It was not much to look at. The white paint had faded years ago. The porch creaked when the wind picked up. The mailbox leaned slightly to one side. But it was home. Ethan parked in the gravel driveway and stepped out into the cold night air. The porch light cast a warm glow across the yard. For a moment, he stood there looking at the house. 12 years earlier, he had stood in that same spot with a different future ahead of him. A different life. Sometimes grief did not arrive like a storm. Sometimes it arrived quietly, sitting beside you at dinner, riding with you to work, waiting patiently in every empty chair. Ethan knew that kind of grief well. Lily climbed out and opened the front door while Ethan carefully helped Charlotte inside. She stirred slightly, but never fully woke. Minutes later, she was resting on the living room couch beneath a thick blanket. The fire crackled softly inside the stone fireplace. The scent of pine wood drifted through the room. Everything felt peaceful again. Almost. Ethan moved through the house, turning off lights and locking doors. The familiar routine never changed. After years of raising Lily alone, routines had become anchors. They gave shape to days that otherwise might have felt too empty. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a framed photograph. Ethan paused in front of it as he always did. The woman in the picture smiled back at him with kind eyes and wind-blown hair. Emily Walker, his wife, the love of his life. Gone for 12 years, but never truly absent. "Good night, Em," he whispered. It was a habit he had never broken. From the hallway, Lily appeared holding her favorite blanket. "I still miss her too," she said quietly. Ethan smiled gently. "I know you do." Lily looked toward the sleeping woman on the couch. "Do you think Mom would have helped her?" Ethan did not answer immediately. The firelight flickered across the room. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Then he nodded. "Your mom never walked away from people who needed kindness." Lily seemed satisfied with that answer. She hugged him tightly before heading upstairs. Ethan remained alone in the living room. The stranger slept peacefully. The photograph watched silently from above the fireplace. Outside, the rain continued to fall across the dark Carolina countryside. And somewhere in the distance, beyond memory and coincidence and time itself, invisible threads were already beginning to pull forgotten lives back together. Charlotte woke to the smell of fresh coffee and cinnamon. For several seconds, she stared at the unfamiliar ceiling above her, confused by the silence surrounding her. There were no ringing phones, no assistants waiting outside a conference room, no endless notifications demanding her attention. Just quiet, real quiet, the kind she had not experienced in years. She slowly pushed herself upright on the couch. A folded blanket rested across her lap. Sunlight filtered through the living room windows, casting soft golden patterns across the hardwood floor. Somewhere nearby, she heard the gentle clink of dishes and the distant sound of birds outside. For a moment, she wondered where she was. Then fragments of the previous evening returned. Rain, a hotel entrance, exhaustion, a stranger's voice asking if she needed help. Charlotte pressed a hand against her forehead and exhaled. Embarrassment settled in immediately. She was not someone who lost control. She was certainly not someone who woke up in a stranger's house. Yet here she was. Before she could gather her thoughts, a small voice broke the silence. "You are awake." Charlotte looked up. Lily stood in the doorway holding a glass of orange juice with both hands. Her long brown hair was slightly messy from sleep, and her smile carried the effortless sincerity only children seemed capable of. "Good morning," Charlotte said softly. Lily stepped closer and handed her the glass. "Dad said you might be thirsty." Charlotte accepted it, surprised by the simple kindness. "Thank you. You are welcome." Lily sat in a nearby chair and studied her for a moment. "You look a lot better today." Charlotte laughed quietly despite herself. "That bad, huh?" Lily nodded with complete honesty. "You looked really sad." The answer caught Charlotte off guard. Adults usually commented on appearances. Children noticed emotions. Before she could respond, Ethan entered from the kitchen carrying 2 coffee mugs. He stopped when he saw she was awake. "Good morning," he said. "How are you feeling?" Charlotte stood quickly. "I should probably start by apologizing." Ethan smiled faintly. "Not necessary. I am pretty sure it is." He handed her a mug. "Trust me. Everyone has difficult days." Charlotte accepted the coffee. The warmth felt comforting in her hands. She glanced around the room again. Family photographs lined the shelves. Handmade school projects sat on a nearby bookcase. Nothing looked expensive. Nothing looked designed for appearances. Yet the house felt more welcoming than many mansions she had visited. Ethan leaned against the kitchen counter. "There is some breakfast if you are hungry." "You really do this for complete strangers?" Charlotte asked. "Help them without expecting anything." Ethan shrugged. "My wife used to say kindness is not kindness if it comes with conditions." The words lingered in the air. Charlotte noticed a brief shadow pass through his expression before it disappeared. She followed his gaze toward the framed photograph above the fireplace. The smiling woman in the picture seemed almost alive. There was love in that photograph, the kind that survived time. Charlotte found herself looking away first. Something about it stirred an emotion she could not explain. "She was beautiful," Charlotte said quietly. Ethan nodded. "She was." Silence settled for a moment. Not uncomfortable silence. Just honest silence. Outside, sunlight danced across the yard. Inside, the smell of coffee and fresh pancakes filled the room. Charlotte had spent years surrounded by wealth, influence, and admiration. Yet somehow this simple kitchen felt richer than any boardroom she had ever entered. And for reasons she could not yet understand, leaving suddenly felt much harder than it should have. Charlotte insisted on leaving before noon. She thanked Ethan twice, thanked Lily 3 times, and promised herself she would never put herself in that position again. Yet as she drove away from the small house surrounded by pine trees, she found herself checking the rearview mirror far more often than necessary. The feeling surprised her. She was used to moving forward. She was not someone who looked back. 3 days later, Ethan was replacing brake pads at the repair shop where he worked when a familiar black SUV rolled into the parking lot. Several mechanics immediately noticed the luxury vehicle. Ethan barely looked up until the driver's door opened. Charlotte stepped out wearing jeans, boots, and a simple navy sweater. There was nothing about her appearance that suggested she managed a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. In fact, she looked more relaxed than she had the morning she left his house. "I brought something," she said as she approached. Ethan set down his wrench. "You did not have to." Charlotte lifted a bakery box. "I know. That is why I did." A few minutes later, they sat at a small picnic table beside the garage, sharing cinnamon rolls from a local bakery. The autumn sun hung low in the Carolina sky, warming the cool afternoon air. Ethan noticed that Charlotte smiled more when she was away from her business world. Charlotte noticed that Ethan listened more than he spoke. It was a rare quality. Most people spent their time waiting for their turn to talk. Ethan simply paid attention. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a school bus stopping across the street. Moments later, Lily appeared, backpack bouncing behind her as she hurried toward the garage. The instant she spotted Charlotte, her face lit up. "You came back," Lily exclaimed. Charlotte laughed. "I did." Lily dropped her backpack onto a nearby bench and sat beside her as if they had known each other for years. Children had a way of deciding who belonged long before adults figured it out. Within minutes, Lily was showing Charlotte drawings from school, talking about her favorite books, and explaining her plans to become either a veterinarian, a pilot, or a bakery owner, depending on the day of the week. Charlotte listened to every word. Not because she had to, because she genuinely wanted to. Ethan watched quietly from a distance. Something about the scene felt strangely natural. For years, Lily had been polite around strangers, but rarely attached herself so quickly to anyone. Yet with Charlotte, there seemed to be an immediate connection. As the afternoon stretched into evening, the 3 of them stopped at a small diner on the edge of town. The waitress knew Ethan by name. The cook knew Lily's favorite meal. Charlotte watched the easy familiarity of it all with quiet fascination. Her life was filled with private jets, executive meetings, and luxury hotels. Yet somehow this simple dinner felt more meaningful than most of the events on her calendar. When they finally stepped outside, the sky glowed orange and gold above the mountains. Lily slipped her hand into Charlotte's without thinking. Charlotte looked down, surprised by the gesture. Then she squeezed gently. Across the parking lot, Ethan noticed something shift in Charlotte's expression. It was subtle, almost impossible to see. But for the first time since meeting her, the loneliness in her eyes seemed just a little smaller. Over the next 2 weeks, Charlotte found herself making reasons to visit the small town more often than necessary. Sometimes she brought books for Lily. Sometimes she stopped by the garage with coffee for Ethan. Sometimes she simply appeared without an excuse at all. To her surprise, nobody questioned it. The town accepted people slowly, but once accepted, they treated them like family. One crisp Saturday afternoon, Charlotte joined Ethan and Lily at the annual fall festival held near the town square. The air smelled of kettle corn, fresh apple pie, and wood smoke drifting from food vendors. Children ran between booths carrying caramel apples, while local musicians played country songs beneath strings of hanging lights. For the first time in years, Charlotte left her phone inside her purse. She did not check emails. She did not answer business calls. She simply enjoyed being present. Lily spent most of the afternoon dragging Charlotte from one activity to another. They painted pumpkins. They entered a pie tasting contest. They laughed through a hayride that wound through fields glowing gold beneath the autumn sun. Ethan watched from a distance more than once, quietly amazed by how naturally Charlotte fit into their lives. As evening approached, the temperature dropped. A cool breeze swept across the festival grounds. Lily wrapped herself in a small cardigan and pulled a silver necklace from beneath her sweater. The pendant hung against her chest, catching the last rays of sunlight. Charlotte noticed it immediately. At first it seemed like nothing more than a simple piece of jewelry. Then her expression changed. Her smile faded. Her eyes locked onto the pendant. The world around her seemed to disappear. "Lily," she said softly, "where did you get that necklace?" Lily looked down. "This?" Charlotte nodded. "Yes. It belonged to my mom." Lily touched the pendant carefully. "Dad says she wore it every day." Charlotte stared at the small silver charm. Her heartbeat quickened. The shape was unmistakable. An oval locket engraved with a tiny wildflower design. She had seen that exact pattern before. Not once. Hundreds of times. Growing up, she had watched her mother sit beside a bedroom window holding an old photograph and crying quietly over a missing daughter nobody ever talked about anymore. In those photographs, the young woman always wore the same locket, the same engraving, the same tiny wildflower. "Are you okay?" Ethan asked, noticing the sudden color draining from her face. Charlotte forced a smile. "Yes, I am fine." But she was not fine. Not even close. That night, long after returning to her penthouse apartment in Charlotte, North Carolina, she could not stop thinking about the necklace. She sat alone in her study while city lights shimmered beyond the windows. Finally, she walked to a cabinet she rarely opened. From inside, she removed an old photo album that belonged to her mother. Dust covered the edges. The pages smelled faintly of age and forgotten memories. Charlotte carefully turned through the photographs until she found the image she was searching for. The moment she saw it, her breath caught. A young woman stood smiling beside a lake. Around her neck hung the exact same silver locket. Charlotte stared at the picture for a long time. Then she looked back at a photograph she had secretly taken of Lily wearing the necklace earlier that day. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Outside her window, the city continued moving as it always had. But inside that quiet room, a mystery that had slept for decades was beginning to wake up. Charlotte did not sleep that night. The image of the silver locket stayed in her mind like a pulse she could not turn off. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Lily wearing it, smiling without knowing the weight of what she carried. At dawn, she made a decision she could not explain even to herself. She drove back to the small town earlier than she had planned, the highway stretching empty beneath a pale morning sky. When she arrived, Ethan was already at the garage, opening the metal shutters. The sound of steel rolling upward echoed through the quiet street. Lily sat on the front steps eating a granola bar, her backpack beside her. She lit up immediately when she saw Charlotte. "You came back again," Lily said happily. Charlotte tried to smile, but her hands were trembling slightly. "I needed to ask you something important." Ethan paused when he noticed her expression. "Is everything all right?" Charlotte nodded, though her eyes told a different story. "I think I may know that necklace Lily is wearing." The words changed the air instantly. Ethan went still. Lily looked between them, sensing the shift, but not understanding it. Charlotte knelt slightly to be at Lily's eye level. "Can I see it again?" Lily carefully pulled the necklace out from under her shirt and placed it in Charlotte's hand. The moment Charlotte held it, her breath caught. It was heavier than she remembered, as if memory itself had weight. The engraving was identical to the one in her mother's photograph. Ethan stepped closer. "Charlotte, what is going on?" Charlotte looked up slowly. Her voice was quiet but steady. "This belonged to my mother's daughter." Silence followed. Not confusion, not disbelief. Something deeper. Ethan frowned. "Your mother's daughter?" Charlotte nodded. "My mother had a daughter before I was born. She disappeared many years ago. My mother never stopped looking for her." Lily tilted her head. "But this was my mom's necklace." Charlotte swallowed hard. "Then we may be talking about the same person." The words seemed too large for the small space they were standing in. A passing car in the distance sounded suddenly louder. A bird landed on the roof and took off again. Even the wind felt different. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, struggling to process what he was hearing. "That is not possible," he said quietly. Charlotte reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. With slightly shaking fingers, she opened an old photograph and turned the screen toward Ethan. It showed a young woman standing by a lake wearing the exact same necklace. Ethan stared at the image. Then he looked at Lily. Then back at Charlotte. Something in his expression shifted slowly. like a door unlocking in a place that had been closed for a very long time. "Where did you get that photo?" he asked. Charlotte hesitated. "From my mother's album." Lily stepped closer, peering at the screen. "She looks like me," she said softly. No one responded. Not because it was untrue, but because no one knew what to say next. Ethan finally exhaled, as if holding his breath had been the only thing keeping him grounded. "We need to talk to your mother," he said. Charlotte nodded. "I already called her." For the first time that morning, the world outside the garage seemed to stop rushing forward. And somewhere between past and present, between memory and truth, something long buried was beginning to rise to the surface. Margaret Bennett arrived just after noon. The black sedan pulled up slowly in front of Ethan's garage, its tires crunching over gravel that suddenly felt too loud for the moment. Charlotte stood beside Ethan and Lily, her hands tightly clasped as if holding herself together. When the car door opened, an older woman stepped out. She moved with careful precision, but her eyes carried something heavier than age. They carried memory. The moment Margaret saw Charlotte, she froze. Not confusion, not curiosity, recognition. The air seemed to shift around her like the world had lost its balance for a second. "Where did you get that necklace?" Margaret asked immediately, her voice sharper than she intended. Lily instinctively stepped closer to Ethan. Charlotte took a slow breath. "From my mother's records. It belonged to her daughter." Margaret's face changed instantly. The color drained from her expression as if the ground beneath her had disappeared. "Her daughter," she repeated softly. Ethan watched closely, his instincts telling him this was no coincidence anymore. Charlotte continued carefully. "My mother had a daughter who disappeared many years ago. She never stopped searching for her." Margaret's hands began to tremble. "What is your mother's name?" Charlotte hesitated for only a moment. "Helen Walker." The name hit Margaret like a wave. She closed her eyes tightly, and for a moment, she looked as though she might fall. Ethan stepped forward slightly, ready to support her if needed, but she raised a hand to steady herself. "Helen," she whispered. "That is my daughter's name." Silence fell over the entire yard. Even the distant sounds of traffic seemed to fade. Charlotte felt her chest tighten. "Then she is your daughter?" Margaret nodded slowly, tears forming in her eyes. "She was my daughter." Lily looked up at Ethan. "Dad." Ethan gently placed a hand on her shoulder, but did not answer. Margaret stepped closer to Charlotte, her voice breaking. "Where did you find her?" Charlotte's voice softened. "She was my mother." The words hung in the air like something sacred and fragile. Margaret shook her head in disbelief. "No," she said quietly. "No, that cannot be." Charlotte opened her phone again with trembling fingers and showed her the same photograph she had seen before. The young woman standing by the lake. The silver necklace. The familiar smile. Margaret reached out slowly, as if afraid the image might disappear if she touched it too quickly. Her fingers hovered above the screen before she finally pressed them against it. A sound escaped her that was not quite a sob, not quite a breath. It was the sound of someone recognizing a truth they had spent a lifetime waiting for. "I looked for her," Margaret said brokenly. "Every day, every year. I never stopped." Ethan stood quietly, watching the weight of decades collapse into a single moment. Charlotte's voice softened. "She never forgot you either." Margaret closed her eyes as tears finally fell. Lily moved forward without hesitation and gently took Margaret's hand. "I think she brought us together," Lily said simply. Margaret looked down at the child, then at Charlotte, then toward Ethan, as if trying to understand how time itself had folded back into this moment. The wind moved gently through the yard, carrying the sound of rustling leaves. Nothing was fixed. Nothing was perfect. But something long broken had finally been found. And for the first time in many years, Margaret whispered, "I can finally go home." In the days that followed, something changed quietly inside Ethan Walker's home. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was the kind of change that crept in gently, like sunlight slowly filling a room that had been dark for too long. Margaret Bennett stayed in town longer than anyone expected. She did not stay in a hotel. She insisted on staying close to Lily, as if distance had become something she could no longer tolerate. Each morning, she arrived at Ethan's house just after sunrise. Sometimes she brought fresh fruit from the local market. Sometimes she simply brought silence and sat on the porch watching Lily play in the yard. Lily, in return, never left her side for long. The child who had once only known a small world of school and home now had someone new who looked at her with an intensity that felt like recognition across time. One morning, Lily ran into the house holding a small wooden box. "Grandma gave me this," she said excitedly. Charlotte looked up from the kitchen table where she had been reading through old family documents with Margaret. "What is it?" she asked. Lily placed the box carefully on the table. Inside were faded photographs, letters tied with thin ribbon, and small keepsakes that had survived decades of searching and waiting. Margaret sat down slowly as she watched Charlotte open the box. Her voice was soft. "I kept everything I had left of her," she said. "I could not let go, even when everyone told me I should." Charlotte carefully picked up one of the photographs. It showed her mother as a young woman standing beside Margaret, both of them smiling in a way that carried no sign of what was to come. "She looks so happy," Charlotte said quietly. Margaret nodded. "She was, before life pulled her away from me." Ethan stood near the doorway, listening but not interrupting. He had learned over the past few days that some conversations were not meant to be entered. They were meant to be witnessed. Lily climbed onto the chair beside Margaret and leaned her head gently against her arm. Margaret hesitated for only a moment before placing her hand on the child's shoulder. The touch was careful at first, then certain, as if something instinctive had taken over. Charlotte watched them both and felt something shift inside her. For years she had built walls around her life. Work, responsibility, distance. Everything had been structured to avoid pain. Yet here, in this small house filled with quiet voices and morning light, those walls no longer felt necessary. Later that afternoon, Margaret asked to walk through town alone. Ethan offered to drive her, but she refused. She needed time, she said. Time to remember without interruption. Charlotte found her later sitting on a bench near the old town square. The wind moved gently through the trees above them. Margaret looked up when Charlotte approached. "I used to sit here with her when she was your age," she said softly. Charlotte sat beside her. "Do you think she ever knew you were looking for her?" Margaret shook her head slowly. "I think a part of her always knew she was loved, even when she could not find her way back." Charlotte looked down at her hands. "I wish I had known her." Margaret placed her hand over Charlotte's gently. "You do know her. She lives in you." The words settled between them like something final and healing at the same time. Across town, Ethan stood outside his garage watching Lily laugh with a neighbor's dog. For the first time in many years, he did not feel like life was something he was surviving. It felt like something he was finally allowed to be part of again. The night of the family dinner arrived quietly, without announcement, as if the world itself understood it was witnessing something delicate. Ethan's small home had never felt so full. The kitchen light glowed warmly against the wooden walls, and the smell of roasted chicken filled the air. Lily moved excitedly between the table and the living room, setting out plates with careful seriousness, as if preparing something far more important than a meal. Charlotte stood near the counter, helping Margaret arrange a simple dessert she had brought from her hotel. For a moment, no one spoke. There was only the sound of dishes, soft footsteps, and the gentle rhythm of a house learning how to hold more people inside it. When they finally sat down together, the silence was not empty. It was complete. Ethan looked around the table slowly. Lily on one side, smiling with bright anticipation. Charlotte across from him, her posture relaxed in a way he had never seen before. Margaret sitting beside Lily, her hand resting lightly on the child's shoulder as if afraid to let go. "I do not remember the last time I sat at a table like this," Margaret said softly. Charlotte glanced at her. "A table like what?" Margaret smiled faintly. "A table where I do not feel like I am still waiting for something to come back." Lily tilted her head. "Nothing is missing tonight." Her words were simple, but they carried a truth that settled over everyone. Ethan reached for the serving dish, breaking the moment gently. "Then let us eat before it gets cold." Laughter followed, small at first, then growing naturally. It was not forced. It was not rehearsed. It simply existed. As the meal continued, stories began to surface. Margaret spoke about her daughter as a child, describing small memories that had survived time. Charlotte listened closely, learning things about her mother she had never known. Ethan shared quiet memories of his wife, careful not to let grief dominate the conversation, but not hiding it either. Lily listened to everything with wide eyes, absorbing each detail as if building a picture of a family she was only now beginning to understand. After dinner, they moved to the living room. The fire burned softly, casting warm shadows across the walls. Margaret sat in Ethan's old armchair, holding a cup of tea. Charlotte sat on the rug beside Lily, helping her arrange photographs on the floor. Ethan leaned against the doorway, watching. At some point, Lily fell asleep with her head resting against Charlotte's arm. Charlotte did not move. She simply stayed still, as if afraid to break the moment. Margaret noticed and smiled quietly. "She trusts you," she said. Charlotte looked down at the child. "I think I trust her too." Ethan stepped forward slowly and placed a blanket over Lily. His hand lingered for a moment, gentle and careful. "She has not slept like that in a long time," he said softly. Margaret watched him. "Neither have you," she replied. Ethan did not answer, but his silence confirmed it. Later that night, after Lily was carried to bed and the house grew quieter, Charlotte stood outside on the porch alone. The sky was clear, filled with distant stars. The air was cool, but not cold. Ethan joined her after a moment, standing beside her without speaking. For a long time, they simply looked out at the quiet road ahead. "I used to think life only moves in one direction," Charlotte said finally. Ethan nodded. "Forward." "Yes," she replied. "But I am starting to think sometimes it circles back to places we were not ready to understand the first time." Ethan looked toward the house, where Lily slept peacefully. "Maybe it is not about going back," he said. "Maybe it is about finally arriving." Charlotte turned slightly toward him, her expression calm, but deeply moved. In the distance, a soft wind moved through the trees, carrying with it the feeling that something broken had not only been found, but gently repaired in the only way time ever allows.